Federal funding for Slice of Life has been provided by Midwest Gloves and Gear as a tribute to all current and retired employees who've committed to our company the past 51 years. And by Pepsi Cola Bottling of Chillilcothe, your local distributor for 72 years, bringing you all the fun, refreshing Pepsi and Dr. Pepper flavors, with additional support from these funders.
Bread has always been symbolic of human sustenance and food and agriculture and all of that. Since Neolithic times, bread has been central to everything. In France, they start revolutions over the price of bread and all this kind of thing. So it's no surprise that bread takes on this charisma.
Ed Douglas, E-D-D-O-U-G-L-A-S.
And Ed, your position?
I am the head of the Sliced Bread Committee in Chillilcothe.
All right. Hot activity this morning in the showroom at Woody's Automotive, and they're not buying cars.
We have 2 seats available.
Steve Holt and Scott Ellis say they're ready for the job.
We've been on a quest.
Even if it means a 1,000-mile drive in freezing conditions.
You don't think they might take the $100 and go wild in Nebraska?
I think they'll have this mob to deal with when they get back if they come back empty-handed.
Weather's moving in Monday, so they got to be back by Monday.
The boys say that barring unforeseen difficulties, they'll bring their prize back by the weekend.
I suppose these days I'm pretty much a big city guy, but I grew up in a small town in Kansas, surrounded by hard-working people, farmers, the kinds of folks who could fix just about anything. Somehow, I landed the best TV job ever. For years and years, I literally got to drive around the country trying to find the most fantastic things in the most unexpected places.
Welcome to the show about things you can see without going far.
Along the way, I saw a whole lot of small towns like mine. And sad to say, many weren't doing so well. But I noticed something, that they often held their head high by rallying around a hometown hero, a big event that took place there, or just something quirky and fun. Sometimes, all that could be found along a single stretch of road, like this one, US 36 in northern Missouri, a 200-mile ribbon that runs from Hannibal to St. Joseph, along the way passing by a series of small towns that gave us some seriously stellar names. Disney, Twain, Pershing, Penny, JC that is. And there's one other name you're probably not familiar with. But by the time we're done with this, we hope you will be.
This is the first picture that I remember of my grandparents and myself. I was about 2.5.
Otto Roeder was in his mid-20s when he made the move from Iowa to Missouri in 1906 to start his career as a jeweler.
All I remember was a quiet, gentle, unassuming person who was always tinkering with watches and clocks that were never quite synchronized.
By his early 30s, Otto owned 3 stores in St. Joe. But something else was already tugging at his heart. Not jewelry, but a machine that would slice bread. Within a few more years, Otto sold his stores to focus on chasing his dream, which began to look more like a nightmare. In 1917, the factory he'd been planning to use went up in smoke, along with his drawings and prototypes. But Otto didn't give up, and the proof is in the patents.
First it was pins put in the bread to keep it together. There's a patent for the pins. They look like long hairpins. And I didn't realize that there were 15 patents, modifying, adding to, redoing the bread slicing machine and the packaging.
This is the great period of technological change around the world, and especially the U.S., which was considered the cutting edge of all of this. early 20th century is the period of the airplane, the car is coming out there, and the assembly line is a big part of this.
As our cities in the Midwest got bigger, and as the migration from the farm into the urban areas happened, you had to find a way to feed people. It was going to happen in bread, it was going to happen in sausage making, it was going to happen in dairy, it was going to happen in cheese making.
But the 1920s were well underway, and it still hadn't happened, largely for a couple of reasons. One, pre-sliced bread, skeptics said, would lose its freshness. Two, the mechanics are a lot harder than you might think.
If you've ever taken a soft loaf of bread and tried to slice it, it doesn't slice. I mean, it smashes. So to create something that could cut it, package it without an engineering degree, I don't know how he was able to create all these things in his mind and then bring them to fruition.
But somehow, Christine's grandfather managed to accomplish exactly what he'd set out to do. He invented a machine that sliced and wrapped loaves of bread. He'd gotten the patents. All he needed was to start selling them. Otto hit the road, crisscrossing the Midwest in search of a buyer. But despite all the bakers out there, and there were still quite a few back then, he found no takers. What Roeder needed was someone willing to take a risk, which turned out to be a bench. One of 4 boys raised on a farm outside Utica, Missouri, Frank Bench eventually moved a few miles east on Highway 36 and opened the Chillilcothe Baking Company. In 1928, he took the plunge, bought Otto's very first slicer, and put it to the test that summer. He didn't have to wait long for the results.
Took off like a rocket.
Bread sales rose something like 2,000%. As word spread, Otto found himself making and shipping machines as fast as he could, to a population increasingly infatuated with the modern, where more and more women were starting to work outside the home.
It happens in a small decision of a housewife deciding that I don't have time to bake bread anymore. I will buy my bread at the supermarket.
Try slicing bread by hand. Unless you're a real expert, there are going to be different sizes, and Ginny's going to be upset that Jane got a bigger piece than he did. But this all appealed to people, this precision. People were looking for convenience, and they had some discretionary income to pay for it, and the timing was there.
As phenomenons go, this was no flash in the pan. Otto's invention spurred rapid improvements in the process, the packaging, and particularly the marketing of it. In 1930, the Continental Baking Company introduced Wonder Bread. Sandwiches, and the consumer never looked back.
You can't hardly tell by the way it looks now, but this was the place, the bakery that Frank Bench built. The very place where on July 7th, 1928, sliced bread was first sold to the world. Wildly successful, of course, not just here, but everywhere. Yet, despite all the impact it made, the Great Depression made more. In just a few years, Frank Bench had no bakery. Otto Roeder was forced to sell his patent and go to work for the company in Iowa that he sold it to. But Chillilcothe just kept rolling along. In 1936, the company came down here and started manufacturing gloves. After a while, some others followed, and before you know it, they're the glove capital of the world. But that's not all. Remember bullet bras? And apparently for a while they were manufactured here too, but unlike the product, sales sagged and the lingerie industry moved on.
This is interesting here. Now there was a very popular machine. That was out the drive-in theater.
Well, that's a drive-in, okay. Do you remember Frank Bench?
Yes, I remember Mr. Bench. I certainly do.
At 102, John Irvin remembers an amazing number of things. Things like the heyday of the CBC, the Chillilcothe Business College. For decades, it brought students in from all over the country to matriculate, celebrate, and leave a few dollars behind. Will continue to grow. The work he's done here has led to more mural painting opportunities elsewhere. But the pride he feels for his adopted hometown makes these all the more special.
Towns need an identity. Chillilcothe really doesn't have one, but I believe with the murals, it's really brought in a lot of tourists and really showcased our town.
Like small towns everywhere, Chillilcothe loves a parade. Kathy Ripley has seen quite a few of them. As a reporter for the local paper, she's covered just about every kind of story in Livingston County, from celebrations to tragedies. Kathy also thought she knew quite a bit about local history. But apparently, like everyone in town except John Irvin, she wasn't aware of that game-changing occurrence on Elm Street back in 1928. And she discovered it entirely by accident. In 2003, Kathy was fishing through microfilm in the public library, researching a book to tout the town's days gone by, when it popped up in front of her in sepia and white.
It said that Chillilcothe was the first place in the world to offer sliced bread to the buying public. And then also there was a full-page ad in that newspaper. I thought, well, this needs a little further investigation.
Sufficiently convinced that the story was solid, Kathy took it to print. Soon the Kansas City Star came around, then the Associated Press. A few phone calls later brought the corroboration Kathy was hoping to get. It was Otto's son, Richard, Christine's father, calling from Arkansas to say, absolutely it's true, and that's me on the bread rack. The 88-year-old soon returned to the scene of his dad's big breakthrough, a visit complete with limo ride and public reception.
I do remember that Ed Douglas was there, and he came up to me, is this really true? This is really happening? Well, we got to do something about it.
Something that quickly started looking like this. The Sliced Bread Committee put a plaque up at the original Slicer's site and got Kelly cooking on a prominent downtown wall. They launched a bread baking contest to call out local cooks.
This is a traditional white.
And soon added a little jam. Complete with the kind of souvenirs the committee hoped no tourist could leave town without.
This mug is a story of sliced bread, coasters, one of my favorites. You can have a shopping bag.
It doesn't take much to be a hook to get people to want to come to your town. Like when we were looking at different towns, there was a town that has a frozen dead guy. Nothing famous about him, he's just dead and he's frozen. And so we think the sliced bread story is much more compelling than that, in that, as you know, it's a standard of all innovation, past, present, and future.
And yet, despite all this, the town still lacked one thing. Something with blades. The original slicer had disappeared. A Rowitter relative donated the second to the Smithsonian, which promptly packed it away. That is why Scott and Steve, remember them, found themselves winging their way on a winter's day along I-80 in western Nebraska. Thanks to the internet, someone saw what the town was seeking, knew somebody who had a slicer, I'm not making this up, and voila! 2 men and a van stand on the cusp of regaining a piece of the past from a chatty couple in Kimball. Randy and Sandy Harmon had been trying to sell it for a friend on eBay.
He was trying to clean out room in his shop. He said, I've got this bread slicer, do you think it sells? I said, I have no idea, we can try. I'll try to sell anything I want.
Steve called, talked to me, and see if we still had it available. I wasn't sure. Talked to my husband, he got a hold of Roger Dosey, and he was getting ready to put it down to his junk pile.
It was going for the crusher? Yeah. He was going to sell it for scrap iron. Well, scrap iron's $200 a ton.
Close call, but the gods of innovation must be smiling on this quest. $100 and a couple of t-shirts later, the deal is done. And even better, the boys get to chat with Arnie Christensen. Arnie remembers working with the machine in his pop's bakery.
I can remember when my dad bought this slicer. It was in the early 30s. The blades travel in opposite directions, so when it's slicing, they go like this.
Back it up a little bit more. How do you rate the motor? 100. I'd give it 100 on a scale of 10.
No mascots to send them back east, but the boys have snacks and adrenaline to push them along. Except for a small oil leak and fewer MPGs, the cast iron load offers no resistance on its way back home.
And now it's one thing to go grab a piece of history at the swap and shop and get it safely back to town. It's another to know exactly what to do with it then. Which is why, since that day in December 2 years ago, the auto roller slicer has been held in captivity at an undisclosed location. And normally, that might be the end of the story, but shocking plot twist ahead. Turns out Chillilcothe was not meant to be a one-slicer town. So, how about a quick recap? Slicer number 1 didn't survive the 70s. Slicer number 2 went to Washington. Now, 10 years ago, after Kathy's big discovery, the local museum, at the time they were all volunteer, approached the Smithsonian and got turned down flat.
So right now it's really good to check the emails.
But they didn't have this lady back then.
This would be a section of our graphs.
Pam Klingerman is, as you might suspect, not from around here. England, by way of Ohio and Denver, with extensive museum experience and charming persistence that can slowly open doors.
Are we on an earthquake fault? How long is the response time from the fire department?
So for almost 2 years, very quietly in case the whole thing were to fall apart, Pam and company have been jumping through hoops to ensure that one well-guarded piece of American history might be available after all.
Your fingers crossed at this? What's
Toes too, legs, you know.
Oh, and a friend in high places doesn't hurt either. Claudia Allen is a Chillilcothe native who's served on the Smithsonian board.
She cut a lot of the red tape for us. And so her email before last was, Otto is smiling.
And today, Kelly will start making a mural. I mean,
Yes.
that feels like a step.
Amazing. When I got the yes, you have permission, it was like, oh.
We can bring out this bench to sit here and have it angled so it's coming to give it a more three-dimensional effect. Then that machine sits in here. We want the machine to be our focal point.
For a can-do-it kind of guy who loves to paint history, there may never be a better opportunity than this.
He had something special that he kept at it. And finally, he found somebody that, you know, saw what he saw. And it just happened to be here in Chillilcothe, and Frank Bench, and two worlds collide, and the Midwestern mentality and belief that, you know, you keep pushing till something happens, and that's what happened here.
The Smithsonian does not send national treasures out in minivans. This climate-controlled art shipping truck pulled up safely at the museum with its precious cargo. But here's where the luxury ends and the forklift takes over. The man at the controls is Marvin Holzer, president of the board and a guy who knows the job well. In mere minutes, Marvin's got it sitting snugly inside museum walls, waiting for uncrating after it sits for a spell. This doesn't mean there still isn't protocol to be observed. A conservator from the Nelson Atkins Museum is on hand to ensure that.
Everybody should take a picture of the inside here.
After all, this baby has to go back to D.C. in 3 years.
Smells like fresh pine. Yay!
There are plenty of curious eyes peering in, not to mention theories thrown out about how it actually worked.
So I bet you loaded it. That didn't look big enough for a lot of bread.
I bet they shaped a little bit and they loaded it back here.
Getting it unpacked is pretty easy, but the next step, not so much. At 500 plus pounds, there is some risk in getting it safely placed on its pedestal. That's when you call the fire department.